They opened the tomb beneath the ice, and within 12 months, every person who entered it was dead. Then a joint coalition buried the entrance, removed the coordinates, and declared the massive structure underneath too dangerous to map. By the end, you'll know what the team reportedly found inside, why their deaths were blamed on an ancient curse, and the far more disturbing reason officials may have sealed the site before anyone could discover where the tunnels led. The story begins with a shape that should not have been there. During the final years of the 1940s, aerial survey crews were photographing remote stretches of frozen wilderness. Most of their images showed exactly what you would expect: empty valleys, fractured glaciers, and mile after mile of white terrain. But one sequence was different. Beneath a thin layer of windblown snow, the photographs appeared to show straight lines. Not cracks. Not ridges. Right angles. The kind nature almost never makes. When analysts compared the images, they reportedly traced a rectangular outline extending hundreds of feet beneath the surface. Smaller lines branched away from it like corridors. The largest section disappeared under a ridge of ancient ice, making its true size impossible to estimate. At first, the formation was dismissed as a geological accident. Then a second flight photographed what looked like an entrance, two dark pillars framing a narrow void. Within months, a multinational expedition was assembled. That detail matters. The countries involved had recently emerged from a devastating war. They distrusted one another, guarded their intelligence, and competed over territory. Yet here, in one of the most inaccessible places on Earth, they were allegedly willing to work together. The official purpose was geological research. The equipment told another story. The team carried drilling machines, sealed specimen containers, respirators, portable generators, and enough explosives to collapse a tunnel. They had not come merely to study the ice. They had come prepared to enter whatever was beneath it. The entrance took nearly 3 weeks to reach. Crews cut through compacted snow, then a layer of blue ice so dense it bent the light. Beneath it, they found worked stone. According to later retellings, the blocks were enormous, tightly fitted, and unusually smooth. There were no carvings on the exterior. No inscription announcing a king, a god, or a civilization. Only a doorway descending into darkness. The first entry team consisted of 8 people: engineers, medical personnel, military observers, and at least one specialist in ancient architecture. Their names never appeared together in any surviving public report. They passed through a short corridor and entered a chamber wider than the entrance suggested. Its ceiling was supported by square columns. Along the walls stood low stone platforms, some broken, others covered by a gray residue. Then the corridor continued downward. That was the first problem. Ground-penetrating measurements suggested the visible chamber was only the uppermost level. Beneath it were larger voids, stacked one below another. The structure was not simply a tomb. It was an underground complex. The deeper they moved, the warmer the air became. Frost vanished from the walls. Moisture formed on their lamps. Several members reported a metallic smell, followed by headaches and an intense pressure behind the eyes. They should have turned back. Instead, they entered a circular room sealed behind a stone barrier. Inside was a raised platform and a long black container. A sarcophagus. But it was far too large for an ordinary human body. The team photographed it, collected dust from the floor, and forced the lid open. Nothing rose from inside. No trap activated. No ancient mechanism began to move. What happened was quieter. And far easier to miss. Within hours, one member of the team developed a fever. The expedition physician blamed exhaustion. The patient was isolated, given fluids, and moved back to the surface camp. By morning, 2 more people were coughing. The symptoms did not resemble frostbite or altitude sickness. Witnesses described chest pain, disorientation, bleeding from the nose, and dark lesions spreading beneath the skin. The first death reportedly occurred on the 6th day. The camp entered quarantine. Supply aircraft were told not to land. Radio traffic shifted onto military frequencies. Specimen boxes removed from the chamber were sealed inside a separate tent, then later burned with the clothing of the entry team. But the illness did not stop. Over the following months, the survivors returned to different countries. Some were hospitalized under false names. Others vanished from professional records. One allegedly died in a railway accident. Another suffered a sudden heart failure despite having no known cardiac condition. By the first anniversary of the opening, every person said to have crossed the inner threshold was dead. That is where the legend of the frozen tomb usually ends: 8 intruders, 8 deaths, 1 ancient curse. It is a perfect story. Maybe too perfect. Because when you search for the expedition, the names shift. The location changes. Even the number of victims is inconsistent. And yet certain details remain strangely stable: the coalition, the unmapped lower levels, the black container, and the order to destroy everything removed from the chamber. But before we get to what may actually have killed them, you need to understand something even stranger. The tomb was not sealed immediately. Officials sent another team inside. The second team arrived with equipment the first group had not carried. Full-face respirators. Rubberized suits. Air sampling pumps. Chemical lamps used to detect dangerous gases. This was no archaeological mission now. It was a containment operation. They remained near the upper chamber and fed telephone cable into the descending corridor. At least 2 remote cameras were lowered toward the next level, though no authenticated footage has ever surfaced. According to the account, the cameras showed passageways extending far beyond the original estimate. Some ended at collapsed walls. Others opened into spaces so large that the lamps could not illuminate the opposite side. Then the cable went slack. When it was recovered, several feet were missing. The end had not been cleanly cut. It appeared brittle and blackened, as though exposed to intense heat or a corrosive substance. The coalition halted exploration. Not because the structure had been mapped, but because it had not. This distinction changes everything. If the complex were merely an ancient burial site, sealing it would destroy an extraordinary historical opportunity. Even during wartime, governments fought to possess discoveries like this. But if the site contained something that could travel beyond the chamber, through lungs, clothing, equipment, or meltwater, then preserving it was no longer the priority. Isolation was. Orders were issued to withdraw all personnel, remove identifying markers, and prepare the entrance for demolition. Before leaving, the second team reportedly made one final examination of the gray residue collected near the sarcophagus. Under magnification, it did not look like ordinary dust. It looked alive. Ancient tombs can kill you. Not through magic, but through biology. Sealed chambers create isolated environments where fungal spores, bacteria, animal waste, and toxic gases can accumulate for centuries. Disturb the air, and particles too small to see can flood directly into your lungs. In 1973, researchers opened the tomb of Polish King Casimir IV in Krakow. In the years that followed, several people connected with the examination died, fueling stories of a royal curse. Investigators identified a more plausible suspect, Aspergillus flavus, a fungus capable of producing dangerous toxins and causing severe infections, particularly in vulnerable lungs. Other tombs have contained ammonia, formaldehyde, hydrogen sulfide, and high concentrations of mold. Symptoms can begin with coughing and fever, then progress into organ damage, neurological distress, or fatal respiratory illness. Now imagine a sealed complex beneath ice. Cold above. Geothermal warmth below. No sunlight. Limited airflow. Organic material trapped for centuries, perhaps millennia. You would have created an enormous biological vault. Opening the sarcophagus could have released a concentrated cloud of dormant spores. The explorers would have inhaled them before recognizing the danger. Their clothing could have carried contamination back to camp. That explains the fever. It explains the coughing. It may even explain why later teams wore sealed suits. But it does not explain everything. A fungal outbreak would justify quarantine. It would justify burning equipment. It might even justify sealing the chamber. It would not necessarily justify removing the site from maps, dividing its records among several governments, and burying an entire structure beneath tons of ice and stone. For that, the coalition needed to fear more than a disease. They needed to fear what the structure proved. This is where the evidence becomes thin, and the story becomes dangerous. No complete expedition file has been authenticated. No confirmed photograph shows the entrance. No government has admitted participating in a mission matching every detail. What exists instead are fragments, second-hand testimony, disputed memoranda, unexplained gaps in travel records, and stories repeated decades after the supposed witnesses died. That means you must separate three possibilities. First, the entire account could be fiction, a modern legend assembled from polar expeditions, tomb curses, wartime secrecy, and real cases of fungal contamination. Second, a genuine excavation may have occurred, but later storytellers exaggerated the size of the site and compressed unrelated deaths into a single year. Third, there may have been an operation, followed by deliberate concealment so effective that only distorted pieces survived. The third possibility is the most exciting. It is also the easiest to abuse. Real cover-ups rarely leave behind a perfect page stamped, "Top Secret," explaining everything. They appear as missing boxes, conflicting dates, budgets without destinations, and witnesses who remember procedures but not names. In this case, the most repeated administrative detail is a transport order issued after the withdrawal. Aircraft crews were allegedly instructed to carry no archaeological objects home. Only medical samples could leave, and even those were divided between laboratories in different countries. No single government would possess the complete collection. No single scientist could reconstruct the findings. That is how a coalition buries information without trusting its own members. You split the truth into pieces. Here is the answer the legend tries to hide. The tomb was probably not buried because everyone who entered died. Everyone may have died because the tomb had preserved a lethal environment, and the structure was buried to stop that environment from escaping. But even that may be only half the truth. The reported lower chambers extended beneath moving ice toward a subglacial water system. If contamination entered that water, it could travel far beyond the excavation site. The coalition was not looking at 8 isolated deaths anymore. It was looking at a route out. That is why the unmapped size mattered. That is why the second team tested the air. That is why the entrance was not simply locked, but physically collapsed. The final operation allegedly lasted 4 days. Engineers placed charges along the stone approach, detonated the surrounding ice shelf, and redirected packed snow over the remaining depression. Equipment too contaminated to transport was abandoned below the blast line. Then the coordinates were removed from operational charts. The official expedition log described the area as geologically unstable and unsuitable for further work. No curse. No supernatural guardian. Just something more believable and, in its own way, more terrifying. People opened a sealed ecosystem, realized they could not control what was inside, and chose to erase the doorway. The deaths became useful camouflage. Call it a curse, and serious researchers look away. Call it folklore, and archives stop searching. Make the claim sound ridiculous enough, and the burial completes itself. Stories like this survive because they attach themselves to real fears. Tombs have poisoned people. Governments have concealed hazardous sites. Military expeditions have operated under scientific cover. Archives have been destroyed, divided, or classified for decades. Each element is plausible. The chain connecting them remains unproven. And that may be the most important lesson. A secret does not need to be completely true to protect something real. It only needs enough truth to attract attention, and enough absurdity to discredit anyone who investigates it. Perhaps there was no gigantic tomb. Perhaps there was only a smaller chamber, a sick expedition, and a panicked containment order. Over time, the chamber became a city. The infection became a curse. The quarantine became an international conspiracy. Or perhaps the legend is a blurred memory of an operation whose original documents still sit in separate archives, filed under geology, medicine, aviation, and military logistics, each fragment meaningless on its own. You are left with a doorway no map acknowledges, a team whose names cannot be confirmed, and one question no version of the story answers. If the coalition believed the danger was contained, why did aerial patrols reportedly continue watching the site for another 20 years? Ice does not preserve things forever. Glaciers move. Crevasses open. Entire landscapes shift several feet each year. A sealed entrance can reappear miles from where it was buried, exposed by wind, melt, or the slow pressure of the ice itself. That possibility may explain the patrols. Not guarding a treasure. Watching for a breach. Today, satellites map remote terrain with extraordinary precision. Yet a structure covered by thick ice can remain invisible without specialized radar, and even radar images can be interpreted as natural formations. If the complex existed, it may still be there. The chambers may still be warm. And whatever remained in the air may still be waiting in perfect darkness, untouched since the coalition brought down the entrance. The curse story asks whether ancient people protected their dead. The real question is whether modern people protected the living. Or merely delayed the moment when someone opens the tomb again. If this broke your brain a little, subscribe. We drop one of these every week. And next time, a man confessed to a crime that hadn't happened yet.